Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to review a mini PC, but it kind of feels like a micro PC. Look at this thing. This is the MinisForum EM780. Now, I love little PCs like this. I've reviewed a couple on this channel before, but they're always a compromise when it comes to performance. The ones that I've reviewed usually can play like maybe up to like PS2 or GameCube, and then they will just fall apart when it comes to playing like 3D based PC games. That's not the case with this one here. To start, the processor inside is the Ryzen 7 7840U. That's the same chip we've seen in a bunch of other high-end handheld PCs over the past year. And it's got some great features like liquid metal cooling, 32 gigabytes of RAM, and up to a terabyte of storage, plus a micro SD card slot so you can expand it really easily as well. And it all comes in at about $650 at the end of the day. So I think that the EM780 is in a unique position because it is a super small footprint. After all, you could throw it in a bag, take it with you on a trip. It even uses USB-C as its power plug, so you don't have to take an extra cable. On top of that, it has all the power that you would probably want while on travel. If it's going to be like your travel gaming setup, or you want to use it for work, all those things are going to work perfectly. And so in this video, we're going to really push the performance here and see exactly what you can get with this device and whether or not it's going to be a good match for you. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, let's start with pricing and specs. They actually have two different models. There's the EM680, which has the Ryzen 6800U, and that one's going to be cheaper. That one is $469 for 32 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage. And that's really not a bad price for a 6000 series CPU. That's going to be a little bit more performant than something like the Steam Deck. Now, what we're reviewing today is the EM780. That's going to have a 7000 series 7840U chip. And there's two different models. They both have 32 gigs of RAM, but the 512 gig storage one is $620, and the one that I'm reviewing today has a terabyte of storage and it goes for $640. And other than the CPU, the specs are going to be the same between these two models. For example, they each have LPDDR5 RAM clocked at 6400 megatransfers per second, but also bear in mind this RAM is going to be soldered right onto the board, so you're not going to be able to upgrade it. But because these devices come with 32 gigabytes of RAM standard, I think that's going to be fine. Now the storage is user upgradable. They have an M.2 SSD with a 2230 size. So that's going to be the same size as we found in like the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally. And like I mentioned before, it does have an SD card slot, so if you want to upgrade your storage that way, that's going to be super handy. For connectivity, we have Wi-Fi 6E as well as Bluetooth 5.3, and we've got 3 different video outputs. In addition to the standard HDMI 2.1, both of the USB 4 ports on the front and the back are capable of video out up to 8K. This will be really great if you have one of those monitors that are also USB-C power delivery. As long as it provides up to 65 watts of power, you'll be able to provide power to the device as well as the video from a single cable. Anyway, let's go over the rest of it when we're actually doing the unboxing, so we'll start there. And as a disclaimer, this is a review unit sent over from MinisForum. No money was exchanged in any way. All opinions are my own, and they're not seeing this video ahead of time. We've got a few things inside the box, including a quick start manual just to give you some of the basics of setting it up. And further down in the box, we've got quite a few other items. To start, we have this little Ethernet dock. So you would plug this into the USB-C port, then your Ethernet, as well as your power port, and you'd be good to go. Speaking of which, here is a look at the power brick. So this looks like just a standard 65 watt GAN charger. And like I mentioned, it just uses a standard USB-C cable. And then finally, we've also got an HDMI cable in the box. Now, first impressions right off the bat is just how small this thing is. Look at the size of it. This thing is so small, I had to keep reminding myself that this is a full-on computer. Anyway, let's go around the sides and look at what we have in terms of I/O. On the front, we have a full-powered USB 4 port, and to the left of that, it looks like an onboard microphone input. In the center, we've got a microphone headphone jack, and then our power button with a green LED indicator on the right. On the right side, we just have some ventilation, so let's move to the back. On the right, we have another USB 4 input, and either of these can be used to power the device. And then we have 2 USB 3.2 Gen 2 USB-A ports. To the left of that, we have our HDMI 2.1, and then on the left side, we also have some I/O. On the far right, we have our BIOS reset button, and then another one of those USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports. And then finally, we have our micro SD card slot, and then a Kensington lock. Up top, we have our small MinisForum logo, and then our ventilation and fan. And then on the bottom, we have some rubber feet which have to be removed in order to actually get to the screws. And really, that's about it. It's a pretty simple setup. And I'm going to say this a lot, but this is a small PC. Look how it is dwarfed by an Xbox controller. In fact, when you line everything up, including the PC and the power cables as well as the HDMI, this is just so small. It almost feels inconsequential in the fact that you could pack this up for a trip and you wouldn't really even notice. If you throw in the controller, you're now good to go with a portable gaming setup that is quite powerful. To give you some context, this computer is so small that you can actually pocket it. Now, I don't think you'd probably want to throw this in most pockets and walk around with it, but it does really help me appreciate where technology is in this day and age. It's kind of crazy that the old computers I grew up with are massive compared to this, and of course this thing is exponentially more powerful. Now, in addition to being a small size, I think that MinisForum took a lot of care and attention into making sure that it kept cool and quiet. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that they used liquid metal as their thermal conductor, but then also the fan itself is very quiet. At idle, it's basically silent, you can't hear a thing, but then even when pushing it to 100% load, it's still really hard to hear. In fact, just to make sure that you could hear it in this video, I had to put the mic about 3 inches away. And let me give you a quick sample of the maximum volume at 100% load. So it's hard to describe how quiet this is, but I would say that your mouse alone is going to be louder than the computer itself. And not only that, the device itself stays relatively cool. I found that at idle it hovers around 53 degrees Celsius, and then when pushed to a max load, it never really got more than like 83 or 84. For me personally, anything under 90 is usually going to be okay for a mini PC, and the fact that it gets nowhere close to that is pretty awesome. Before we get into the gaming part of things, I do want to do just a couple tests just to see how it's going to perform. We'll start by playing a 4K video over YouTube using no resolution scaling. Now, when I first started the video, it dropped a few frames, so after a few moments I saw that it had dropped 7. However, fast forwarding into later in the video, after over 5,000 frames, it still was staying at only 7 of those dropped. So I think in terms of using it for 4K video playback, or maybe even as a media server, I think it'll be fine. Next, I also ran the Time Spy score in 3D Mark just to see how it performed when it came to GPU intensive benchmarks. And I've tested this CPU in a lot of different contexts, both with mini PCs as well as with handhelds. And for most of those, I usually will get somewhere around like 3100 as my Time Spy score. Now this one's a little bit lower, you can see it's 2964 at the end of the test, but you also have to bear in mind that they kept the power profile on this somewhat low, so I never really saw it get over 30 watts. And I assume that has to do with the fact that we really don't have a lot of space to work with and they want to keep the temperatures cool. So I think that's why we're seeing a little bit lower performance when it comes to these benchmarks. But as always, I prefer to actually test real world games to see what kind of actual performance we'll get. So we're going to go through the gamut here, starting with lighter weight games and then pushing our way up. But this is also going to be somewhat streamlined just because I've tested this chip a lot and so I know what to look for. Starting with lightweight games like Hades, here I'm playing it at 1080p in default settings and I turn VSync off. And here you can see we're getting an average frame rate of about 200 frames per second, so this is going to be great. Moving over to Xbox 360 era games, things like BioShock Infinite. This one can play at 1080p in high settings and still get a steady 60 frames per second. And again, I'm just kind of amazed by the small size of this device. It's only really about the same size as a Miyoo Mini Plus. And the fact that we're getting such smooth performance on these games is really impressive. Next, we're going to test what I call former AAA titles. We're going to start with Doom Eternal at 1080p with medium settings. And here with VSync off, I'm getting an average of about 63 frames per second. So in this case, I would probably just set it to VSync at 60 Hz and be good to go. And that's what I did for Rise of the Tomb Raider, 1080p with low settings this time. This is a gorgeous game, and so 1080p low settings still looks really great. Now, this wasn't a steady 60 frames per second. I did get dips down into like the mid and low 50s, but all the same, it was still a very playable experience. Another one that couldn't quite hit a steady 60 frames per second was Control at 1080p in low settings. Again, this one is a pretty hard game to actually play in 1080p, and so I think it's impressive enough that it's getting well over 50 frames. You can do a couple things here. You could drop it down to 720p, or you could lock the frame rate to 50 and just be good to go. And again, we're talking about a mini PC that is much smaller than a box of tea bags. Speaking of tea bags, next up is Destiny 2. So this is at 1080p in low settings, and here I actually got a pretty stable 60 frames per second. It would still drop down to like 59, 58, but still completely playable. And I really love the idea of having a travel-friendly or portable version of Destiny 2 to take with me. I can imagine myself hooking this up to a large hotel room TV and just having a great time. In fact, this mini PC is only a little bit larger than my cheap travel mouse. Next, let's try out some PlayStation ports. We're going to start with God of War 1080p low settings. And for this one, the average frame rate was on 42 frames per second. And so if I did want to keep this at 1080p in low settings, which I think still looks really good, I would then lock it to 40 frames per second. And I do something similar with Spider-Man Remastered. Again, 1080p low settings and maybe, 40 frame lock, and it'll be pretty close. It does dip down a little bit lower than that from time to time, but not enough for me to want to lock it at 30. So I think that'll be a great experience when it comes to those PlayStation ports. Not too shabby for a mini PC whose footprint is about the same as the Steam Deck dock alone. Let's keep pushing into games that are going to be a little bit harder to run. We're going to start with Cyberpunk 2077, and this one at 1080p in low settings with no FSR on gives me an average of about maybe 32 to 35 frames per second. So this is something I would definitely lock at 30, and I think that'll still be a very console-like experience. And even though this game can do all sorts of crazy stuff at 4K with ray tracing and all that kind of stuff, it still looks pretty good at 1080p. But I would say it doesn't look quite as good as my Yoshi amiibo, which I think is super cute, and they just so happen to be about the same size. Next, we're going to test out Witcher 3. We're going to follow the same theme and use 1080p in low settings. And here the frame rate was actually not bad. It was average about 44 frames per second. So here I would lock it at 40, and I think that would be a pretty smooth experience. Even though it's an older game, I'm still pretty impressed by this performance, especially considering the fact that it's about the same size as two different Pez dispensers. And then finally, the last PC game that I tested was Baldur's Gate 3, 1080p low settings, but with FSR turned on, 2.2, and then set to the ultimate quality setting. And here I'm getting an average of about 40 frames per second, but I did see quite a few dips down to about 35 or so. And so in this game, I would probably lock it at 30 so I didn't have that slowdown and jitter. And even though I haven't played this game fully, so I'm not sure how it's going to be in the later game segments, I think this is still pretty promising. And I never thought we'd be able to play this game on a mini PC that's about the same size as my Famicom cartridge of Super Mario USA, or also known as Super Mario Bros. 2. Speaking of Mario, let's do some emulation. We'll start with Nintendo GameCube because I don't really think we need to focus on the other systems. And we'll start with a hard to run game like F-Zero GX at a 3x resolution, so that'll be beyond 1080p. And here, even in a later track, which is kind of hard to run, you can see we're getting a pretty darn stable 60 frames per second. It's pretty amazing that we can play the entire GameCube library on this little PC, considering the fact that it's just a fraction the size of the original GameCube. Moving on, we're going to do PlayStation 2 at a 3x resolution, so that'll be beyond 1080p, and we'll also try a hard game. We're going to do God of War 2. And as you can see here, it's running smooth as butter. In fact, it's only getting about 14 watt TDP just to keep it running. And I think this is a great indicator that any PS2 game that you try to run on here, as long as it's compatible with the emulator, is going to work just fine, even at a 3x resolution. And you can do all that in a mini PC that's only a little bit larger than this small fake plant that my wife and I bought in Indonesia last summer. It was only a few bucks, and we thought it would look good in a couple thumbnails, and so this has been around the studio as well. Moving on, let's try out Nintendo Wii U emulation. I tried out a few different games here. We'll start with Legend of Zelda Wind Waker HD. This one is at a native 1080p resolution, and it also runs at 30 frames per second. Now here in the forest with the fog and all that, it's actually a little bit harder to emulate, but even then it's only taking about 11 watts to get to where it needs, so this is a good indicator that Wii U is going to be great. Here's New Super Mario Bros. U running at a 1080p resolution, and same thing here, only pulling about 11 watts and still getting a full frame rate of 60 frames. Now of course the hardest game to run is Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and for this one I actually upscaled it to 1080p just to make sure it was nice and crisp, and I set it to a 40 frames per second cap just to give me a very smooth experience. And it would dip down to like 38 frames here and there, but even then I had to actually see it happen on the screen to even notice it. If I hadn't seen the metrics on the top left, I wouldn't have been able to tell you that there was a dip below 40 frames per second. So a very smooth and easy experience here. And speaking of easy experiences, it's about the same size as a can of sardines. And fun fact, for a while, my oldest son actually considers sardines to be his favorite food. He even asked for it for his birthday meal one year. And so that was a very easy experience, much like how it is playing Breath of the Wild on this little mini PC. Let's stick with the Nintendo theme and move up to Nintendo Switch. This one I'm going to run everything in docked mode using the latest version of Yuzu, and as expected, everything runs really well. Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening is a stable 60 frames per second once the shaders compile, and same thing with Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Now I did try upscaling this to a 2x resolution and it wasn't quite there. It got an average of about 48 frames per second in that part, so I would just keep this at the native resolution docked mode for a smooth 60 frames. And Super Mario Odyssey also performed really well, so I think this is a great fit. Now what's not a great fit is the fact that this mini PC is about the same size as a salt shaker filled with toothpicks. For some reason my wife insists that this is the best way to store toothpicks even though they don't actually come out of the hole, so it's just a pain to get to them. Either way, it's also impressive that they're about the same size. Moving on, let's try out PlayStation 3. We're going to use the latest build of RPCS3 and run everything at the native resolution. Now, easier to run games like Dead or Alive 5 or Mirror's Edge played absolutely no problem, not having any sort of dips whatsoever. So I think a lot of 2D and light 3D games on the PlayStation 3 are going to run absolutely fine. Even when you get into the more heavyweight 3D world kind of games like Prince of Persia, I'm still seeing some really good performance. Now by default this game runs at 30 frames per second, but if you look on the wiki page for this game, you can actually unlock it all the way up to 60. And while it doesn't hit a stable 60 frames per second with this chip, it still gets pretty close, and really anything over 30 is going to feel very smooth. So I would definitely play it with this kind of setup right here and it'd be a great time. Now if you tried to play the ultra hard games to emulate, like God of War 3, this one's not going to play at full speed. And that's because this game requires a lot of wattage to actually run at 30 frames per second or higher. And because the TDP is somewhat limited just because they're trying to keep the device nice and cool, you can see that we are getting below 30 frames per second a lot of the time when trying to play this game. But as an added bonus, if you look up at the GPU temperature at the very top, you can see it only hovers around 64 degrees Celsius. And so this mini PC is going to stay relatively cool no matter what you throw at it. Speaking of cool, it's also quite a bit smaller than my BioShock Big Daddy Funko Pop. Now to round things out, we're going to emulate one more system. We're going to do Xbox 360. For this one, we're using the latest Canary build of Xenia at a native resolution. And I found that most games will play at a full frame rate, including Crackdown and Gears of War, but I did find a couple games that struggle to maintain a solid 30 frames per second, like Project Gotham Racing 4. So I think that not every Xbox 360 game is going to run at full speed, especially considering the fact that compatibility is kind of low on this emulator. But all the same, if it runs well on Xenia, there's a good chance it'll run pretty well on this mini PC too. Okay, and one other use case I wanted to talk about is the fact that you can just boot into Batocera on this chipset. It's going to work great. You've got a couple different ways you can do this. You could install it on a flash drive or a micro SD card and then boot into that. And this is a Linux-based operating system that is retro game and emulation focused. And this is probably one of the better use cases for this device, especially considering the fact that it has a micro SD card slot. So in theory, you could just run Windows on the internal storage and then pop in the micro SD card slot for Batocera gaming anytime you wanted. And the performance here is going to be great, about on par with Windows, although some systems like Xbox will actually play better. But one thing worth noting is that Secure Boot was turned on with my test device by default. That means I had to go in and make an admin password, then turn off Secure Boot so that I could boot into Batocera. And then also when I booted back into Windows, the whole BitLocker thing came up, so I had to put in my recovery key. So it is an extra step to go back and forth between the two, so you would probably have to modify your security settings if you wanted to make it a little bit more seamless. Either way, I love the fact that we can dual boot this system, even using that micro SD card. And I think it's equally as impressive is the fact that this mini PC is so small that it takes up about as much space as a single pack of a Spam slice. Alright, with all of that testing out of the way, I think it is time to start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the EM780. And of course, number one, the thing I like the most is the fact that this is super small. In fact, it's not much larger than a Vinylmation figurine of Lambert the Sheepish Lion. Anyway, I think that's the last comparison I'm going to make, but I had to throw that last one in there. Either way, yes, this device is super small, and it's amazing considering the fact that we have really good performance here as well. It's not going to be able to play every AAA game at full resolution, but the fact that you can even play those games in the first place is just really impressive. I also love the fact that it has an SD card slot built in, so you can expand your storage or dual boot if you'd like. I also love the fact that it's USB-C powered, considering this is a travel-minded PC. So as long as you have one of those travel bricks that can provide at least 65 watts of power, you can use this on this mini PC. And then also, if you want to dock it at home, if you've got a monitor that can provide a 65 watt power delivery, you can power it and get video from the same cord. Not only that, the device is ultra quiet. Even when trying to push it at 100% load, it is actually very hard to hear. And while I would say this is not a cheap mini PC by any means, the fact that we're getting something so small and powerful at a decent price is not bad. In fact, I think its main competition is not going to be other mini PCs, but other handheld PCs that are running a similar chip. For example, the ROG Ally is around $700 at retail price, and the chip and power profile in the Ally is very similar to what you would find in the EM780. The only main difference here is that the Ally can also be used in handheld mode. It's got a battery, it's got a screen, and onboard controls. So it does make the Ally more of a portable device in the fact that you don't have to hook it up to anything. And this one can also be docked like the mini PC, but it will obviously take up more space. So it's going to come down to whether or not you want a portable handheld gaming machine and also how much size you have to spare. Now, of course, this thing is not perfect, so let's talk about a couple of things I didn't like about it. Number one is the fact that by virtue of being so small and compact, you have some limited upgrade options. Really, when it comes down to it, the only thing you can do is change out the M.2 2230 for more storage. If you wanted to add an additional drive or change out the RAM, unfortunately, this is a little bit too limited for that. Another limitation I found is that the security setup for this machine didn't make dual booting super easy. Now there's a trade-off there obviously because it makes your machine more secure, but all the same, considering the fact that we have that SD card slot on the side, I would just have liked the dual boot mode to be a little bit easier to get to. And finally, the other thing that we just talked about is the fact that it's a similar price to equivalent handheld. So if you are looking for a handheld machine that you can dock, it might be in your best interest to get more use cases by going that route as opposed to a really small mini PC. But of course, the presence of handheld PCs doesn't take away from the fact that I was really impressed by the MinisForum EM780. It'll mostly come down to your use case and whether or not you want something that's ultra portable. If you're on the road a lot, I think it makes a lot of sense. Or for example, if you're going to be transporting it around for like business meetings and presentations, or you want to do some video editing or music production on the go, I think all of those are going to work really well with this setup. However, if you're not looking for a super compact version, I think that if you pay just a little bit more for some of the other mini PCs I've reviewed on this channel, you'll actually get a little bit more bang for your buck because those can go to a higher wattage of TDP. So if you are going to stick around for this $650-ish price point, I think you have other options that you can choose. But if you're looking for something really small and powerful, I think the EM780 is the one to beat. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Was this one meeting all of your needs, and what was your favorite size comparison across this video? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.